Welcome to the Australian Prescriber Podcast. Australian Prescriber, independent, peer-reviewed and free.
Welcome to the Australian Prescriber Podcast. My name is Ashley Broomfield, your host for this episode, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to Louise Grenell, who is a Senior Medicines Information Pharmacist at Alfred Health in Melbourne. Welcome, Louise.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Louise, what is a Senior Medicines Information Pharmacist?
Our role is to look at a variety of things. We're obviously a pharmacist that's had generally extensive sort of clinical experience, but we might get asked particular questions a little bit more in detail, such as, drug interactions. We're involved in lots of guidelines. We have our hands in lots of many pies. So there's different sort of specialties of medicine information pharmacists at different centres, and some may specialise more in pregnancy or breastfeeding or paediatrics, but we're able to access a lot of different resources and really tap into those to help provide more information in the clinical context for the prescriber.
Awesome. So what sparked your interest to write an article on drug interaction resources?
Some of the original focus of the article was actually targeting enzalutamide. Now, this is a relatively new anti-androgen for metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. So generally going to be seen more so in GP land, but it's probably actually under-recognised as a really major contributor to drug interactions. We like to think of it like a rifampicin in terms of really complex, in terms of potent CYP induction, amongst other things, but also it's got a very long half-life. So it's really hard to determine when exactly it will start interacting with things. And again, if it was needed to be stopped, when that induction and potential will finish in the complications of the half-life. So we started looking at the references, because a lot of times patients on enzalutamide are going to be elderly patients, will also be on direct-acting oral anticoagulants or DOACs, and they themselves have quite complex metabolism. So this led to like a review of all the different drug interaction resources and just really started to tease apart, where some of the gaps existed and why some of those gaps existed. And some of it's actually, it almost stems from the product information for enzalutamide, which is a little bit conflicting in some of the component of PGP. So that sort of sparked a review of all the different interaction resources available, and sort of tried to, give some guidance to prescribers about where best to look and what the advantages and disadvantages are, and just to sort of think big picture with some of these and not be reliant on the fact that every resource is going to have every interaction in there.
So my next question is, for general practitioners, often the interactions checker that we use is the eMIMS that's linked to our prescribing software. What are some of the limitations of using that as a resource only?
Well, I think the challenge just broadly with drug interaction resources, and not just limited to eMIMS, there is just a lot of new drugs actually have very complex metabolism, and there's like a lack of real-world data for the drug combinations. So often when the drug was done in clinical trials, often drugs were excluded. All the possible combinations of drugs often weren't studied in the clinical trials. And so when you get it being used in the real world, those combinations aren't always available, and therefore references such as MIMS and Stockley's and other resources that we use don't always have the interactions listed for every drug. So we just need to be mindful when we're thinking about a drug interaction. If it isn't listed, we've still got to go back to that first principles of thinking, okay, how does the drug work from a pharmacology perspective? What are the issues of pharmacokinetics, and start thinking about cytochromes and PGP, and actually thinking about some of those things at the beginning and using that in combination with the resources, and not necessarily being reliant on one resource, looking around in multiple resources, especially for some of those newer drugs where the information isn't just readily as accessible.
And so apart from the interaction checkers linked in with our software, what other resources are there available that are easy to access?
I'd highly recommend the AMH, and I have no conflict of interest in recommending them, but they have relatively recently updated their online checking ability. So you can put in a couple of drugs, a couple of classes of drugs, and they often then give very practical information about if an interaction exists. They also comment that although there's no documented interactions, they then will quickly provide for you that pharmacokinetic information to allow you as a clinician to go, okay, these ones may interact or not because of the cytochrome effects or PGP. So it allows you to start thinking about the possibilities of drug interactions. Certainly in hospitals, we also have access to other dedicated resources like Stockley's, like Lexicon. And in the article, I actually also provide lots of links to amazing free resources that are available for dedicated areas. So you've got your antiretrovirals, your Hep C, your antifungals, your oncology. And as Dr. Geraldine Moses has also recommended, there's herbal references, and one of the big ones that we use is natural medicines, which, although it is a subscription, it's actually a relatively cheap subscription, and that's a really great reference source as well.
What about when we're prescribing a new medication that may not have all of that real-world data out there, and we're not looking at an interaction between one drug but multiple drugs? We know that when anybody is on multiple drugs, it's more the additional effects that actually contribute to adverse outcomes, and they can be difficult to predict. Are drug interaction resources useful for when you've got multiple drugs on board, or is it usually just one drug compared to another?
Yeah, look, I think there's still quite a big gap in that particular area. I mean, fundamentally, most of the key interaction checkers really do rely on one-on-one drug interactions. And so, yes, you've got to look and see. Some of them, some of the online resources such as even Stockley's and MIMS allow you to put in multiple drugs, but you're still looking one against the other. There is some discussion with my MI colleagues about a new script, which may have a little bit more potential to do that. But I think that's still very much a work in progress. And I think it's very difficult for any drug interaction resource to be able to reliably put all of that data together for the interactions and make a best suggestion of what can happen. And also being mindful of interactions are so variable per patient. It's, there's so many other patient factors at play. There's, your pharmacogenomics, if it's a QT issue that you're worried about, it's whatever your, current sort of QT ECG status may be, or your other comorbidities. There's so many factors. So again, even being mindful that if there was a interaction resource that actually was able to determine all of those, you still have to put everything in the context of your patient. So the short answer is no, there's not a place to go to that's going to weigh up all of these factors and give you the answer that you want. You've really got to be thinking per drug or sometimes per class of drug. Per class of drug may be good if you're thinking of what is the best maybe antifungal azole to choose. You might want to look in that class and go, okay, these ones are less likely to interact.
So we're pretty safe from AI in terms of drug interaction checkers at this stage in medicine.
Look, there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure, with the MIMS ones that exist in electronic prescribing, and certainly in hospital systems, there's a lot of discussions about electronic decision support. Whether you'd say that's AI is a bit debatable, but I think, certainly in the US field where they've had a lot of decision support in electronic systems for a long time, and I link into one of those articles in my paper that there's a big thought process or a think tank about, well, what is actually the best alerts to actually have in there. You don't want to override people and give alert fatigue and have too many interactions that aren't clinically relevant. So how you actually fine tune that, and that sort of work's starting to happen as well in Australia, and trying to come to some consensus about what is it that prescribers really need on the ground in terms of interactions, and what are the key resources to support that.
Yes, definitely. Often you can have multiple alerts per medication, and you can turn on and off alerts as you would like to as well in software. And so if someone doesn't like having the alerts come up, you can actually turn them off, which is risky, but also less time consuming in terms of the amount of clicks to get rid of all the alerts that come up. And definitely something when I read your article that I responded to is that alert fatigue, because a lot of the alerts that come up are not necessarily clinically relevant, and they're common known interactions. And so it's something that I'm taking into consideration anyway. Something that I have noticed is things that we're aware of that the prescribing software isn't aware of, such as the triple whammy effect of ACE inhibitors, non-steroidals and diuretics. It doesn't often bring up an alert like that. And the other thing is the pharmacogenomics. So it's quite common, particularly in psychiatric medicine, for people to have some pharmacological genomics done. And then there's no way of putting that into our prescribing software to allow for alerts to occur. So that's something that the clinician needs to be aware of, which is, very interesting to me, because you're looking at it for a specific class of medications such as psychotropics, but then it has a potential impact on all the other medications that that the patient may need to be prescribed as well, and it makes prescribing a lot more complex.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case. And that's why the one that I have mentioned there, which is UScript, which is a subscription-based resource, does actually tend to now provide that information based on phenotype. So you can look and see if you were going to use these particular combinations and your patient had a pre-existing, they were slow or a fast sort of, status for a particular enzyme. That may give you some extra advice. But you're right, there's no perfect interaction system in any decision support that can accommodate for all those individual patient factors. But it's certainly, something of great interest. And what you were saying before about that, some of the alerts that come up are maybe quite obvious to a lot of prescribers. But then we have to think about, well, what about prescribers that are newly registered medical practitioners that may not have seen all different combinations, and so some things that are obvious to one may not be obvious to the other. And that's also that big challenge of, you want to have the best possible drug interaction database that accommodates everyone. And you may have, if you were having a debate about which ones you include and don't include, that is a challenge, because someone may be very familiar with those and go, oh no, that's okay, but the next person goes, oh, well, I'm not familiar with those. And that is the challenge that exists in building a lot of those decision support.
Given that there's so many limitations of interactions checkers, there almost needs to be that final check in case that it didn't get picked up. What are the kind of medications that we need to be more wary of doing that third process with?
So certainly the DOACs come up high in my list of ones in terms of interactions. Certainly all the antifungals and all the azoles really high up there with drug interactions. Transplant populations often on lots of the immunosuppressants that are very prone for interactions, and antiretrovirals, again, lots of interactions with those. But also your complex oral antibiotic options. So your patients on rifampicin, we're prone to lots of drug interactions, and even some of the other oral antibiotics and linezolid and ciprofloxacin, things that would be more commonly seen now, that you just got to be thinking extra hard about what are the potentials for interactions. Certainly lots of other drugs I should add in are certainly our good old-fashioned and our popular carbamazepine and some of the other antiepileptics. And look, there's lots of other drugs, but they're, in terms of the recent years and the expanded use of those in community, they're ones that really sort of come to the forefront for drug interactions.
And what other resources are there available to primary care providers apart from interaction checkers in terms of medicine support?
Well, it's like in my article, talk about lots of free interaction resources that are available and some specialised ones that are available from hospitals. Hopefully most GPs certainly have access to pharmacists at the community. Some pharmacists are operating GP practices that can probably sit and do that full in-depth review of all the drug interactions and consider all the options. Best practice is always to get the full drug history, and that's obviously all the prescribed medications, your over-the-counter, or your complementary medicines. And just a reminder to actually consider all routes of therapy, and such as inhaled and topical. So there's been some recent cases with interactions with patients who are on fluticasone in inhalers, such as seretide, and patients who are then also on very potent 3A4 inhibitors, such as protease inhibitors, as part of an antiretroviral therapy. And that combination has actually resulted in patients experiencing Cushing's, because the protease inhibitors has increased the fluticasone. And nowadays, with intranasal fluticasone being available over the counter, just a reminder to actually have those discussions with the patient very early on in working out what potential interactions could occur, just so that we've got that full picture of the scenario.
And once we've ceased a medication, is there anything we need to be wary of in terms of the interactions?
A lot of this is dependent on the drug's half-life. So as a general rule, if drugs have got short half-life, they'll be cleared, easily from the body. So you might not find that the impact on the interaction is prolonged. When we think specifically about drugs that actually induce cytochrome enzymes, it's really important to think that the induction effect only takes a couple of days to actually turn on, but actually can take weeks to reverse at the other end. So in the case of carbamazepine or rifampicin, you could be looking at reversal of those inductions about 2 to 3 weeks later. So it's really mindful if you're starting to change doses of drugs based on induction effects, just to be really mindful that you may need some dose changes at 2 to 3 weeks later after those agents are ceased.
That's unfortunately all the time that we've got for this episode. Thanks for joining us today, Louise.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
The views of the hosts and guests on the podcast are their own and may not represent Australian Prescriber or NPS Medicine Wise. I'm Ashley Broomfield, and thanks for joining us on the Australian Prescriber podcast.